I felt the cool metal of the clinic door push open as I stepped outside, the edge of it bumping lightly against my shoulder. My balance shifted, and I leaned harder on my cane, letting my weight settle before taking the next step. A small ache moved through my knees, the kind that reminded me I was no longer young. Then I heard my son's breath, a sharp, irritated exhale behind me, and something in my chest tightened. Nothing about the moment felt safe. He walked ahead of me with quick, restless steps, glancing back as if I were a burden he was forced to drag along. "You move too slow," he muttered, just loud enough for me to hear. His tone wasn't frustration from concern. It carried impatience, annoyance, a hint of something colder. I tried to steady myself before following him into the parking lot, but he didn't wait. He never waited anymore. The afternoon light hit the pavement as I stepped forward carefully. My cane tapped the ground, steady and dependable, then his hand shot out without warning. He ripped the cane from my grasp so violently my shoulder jerked back. Before I could ask what he was doing, he threw it across the asphalt. I watched it clatter and roll, landing flat and useless several feet away. He leaned close to my ear. "Walk or fall." He whispered the words sharp and flat. My balance broke instantly, and I felt the ground tilt beneath me. I reached out blindly and caught a metal railing, gripping it with both hands before my legs gave out completely. My breath came in tight bursts, not from exertion but from the shock of what he'd just done. I turned my head slightly and saw him standing there, expression hard, jaw clenched. A movement in the window drew my attention. A security guard inside the clinic paused mid-step, eyes narrowing as he looked out toward us. He had seen something, maybe not everything, but enough to register concern. My son noticed the guard too. His posture changed immediately, his face softened into an effortless smile as he stepped toward me. "Dad, careful," he said brightly, loud enough for anyone watching to assume kindness. He grabbed my arm in a firm grip, but it wasn't supportive. It was possessive, controlling. His fingers tightened just enough to remind me who held the power in that moment. A couple walked past the entrance, glancing our way, fooled by his display of helpfulness. I kept my eyes on the ground, forcing my breathing to steady, every instinct telling me something had shifted. Something dangerous. The cane on the pavement was no longer just a cane, it was a warning. Something in my own son had turned. The walk back to the car felt longer than it should have, and not because of the missing cane. Something heavier traveled with me, an old ache, but not in my bones. It sat in my chest, the kind that comes when you finally see a pattern you'd been trying to excuse. As he opened the car door with sharp, impatient movements, I found my mind drifting to the months that led us here, months when I had convinced myself he was helping. I had been widowed for almost 8 years, and the house felt too big once the silence settled in. After the minor stroke last winter, my world grew smaller. Even simple things, groceries, bills, climbing the steps, took more focus than before. That was when my son stepped in. He offered to drive me to appointments, handle my errands, keep track of the little things that slipped through the day. I had been grateful then, relieved even, to have someone nearby who cared enough to step forward. But over time, his help stretched into places I never asked it to go. He started choosing which doctors I should see. Canceling appointments, he said, were not necessary, then scheduling new ones without telling me. I would learn about them only when he pulled into a parking lot and said, "We're here for your checkup." He spoke to nurses and staff as if I weren't standing next to him, answering questions meant for me, correcting me when I had my own answers. His comments always came wrapped in a sigh or a thin smile. I walked too slow. I repeated myself. I forgot things he claimed he'd already told me. Some of his words were quiet, some careless, but all of them carried the same message: I was becoming a burden he tolerated. I remembered one afternoon when he stood in my living room, arms folded. He told me selling the house might be smart, before things get worse. When I asked what he meant, he shrugged and said nothing. The conversation ended with a pat on my shoulder, but the look behind it lingered far longer. And there were the subtle things. The way he'd rush me when I buttoned my coat, the irritation when I paused to catch my breath, the tight jaw when I asked him to slow down the car. I had mistaken those shifts for stress or impatience or a son worried about an aging father. But standing in that parking lot just minutes earlier, watching my cane fly across the pavement, something settled into place. His voice telling me to walk or fall wasn't born in that moment. It had been growing, month by month, hiding inside every helpful gesture he offered. Now the truth stood clearer than ever. The help I trusted had already turned into control. By the time I reached my living room that evening, the skin on my wrist had started to darken. A faint bruise shaped like fingers marked the place where he'd grabbed me outside the clinic. I traced the outlines slowly, feeling the dull ache beneath it. It wasn't the kind of bruise you get from a door frame or bumping a table. It was the kind that came from someone holding on too hard. When I asked him about it later, he didn't even look up from his phone. He simply said, "You're getting clumsy, Dad." Probably hid it at home, as if he'd rehearsed the answer. The next morning, the physical therapist raised an eyebrow the moment I sat down. She pressed gently on my shoulder and asked why my posture was stiff, why I seemed guarded when I lifted my arm. Her tone wasn't dramatic, just attentive. Still, it made something inside me tighten. I told her I was just tired. She studied me for a second longer, then nodded, but I could see the concern she didn't voice. Later that afternoon, a different kind of chill settled in. I reached for my medication organizer and noticed the rows weren't the way I had arranged them. The morning pills I always place on the left were now on the right. One compartment was half empty. 2 doses were missing entirely. I checked the kitchen counter, the sink, even the small drawer where I sometimes misplace things. Nothing. When I asked my son, he didn't hesitate. He said he had organized them better while I was showering. His tone was casual, but the explanation didn't match the scene in front of me. My instinct told me something was wrong, but instinct needs proof. I stood there for a moment, staring at the altered box, and felt my mind sharpen the way it used to when life demanded caution. I took out my phone, photographed each compartment, then wrote the date on a small notepad I kept by the couch. That evening, my neighbor paused by my walkway as I checked the mail. She mentioned hearing my son's voice through an open car window earlier, low, sharp, tense. She didn't catch the whole conversation, only a few words, but those few were more than enough. He needs to give control sooner. She shrugged, unsure what it meant. I didn't tell her I already feared I knew. Once inside, I placed the notepad on my table and sat down. The bruise on my wrist pulsed in rhythm with a new realization. I began documenting everything, marks on my skin, missing doses, changes I hadn't made. Quiet records of a truth he didn't expect me to track. I asked for a private moment with my doctor during my follow-up appointment. He closed the door behind us, pulled up a chair, and waited for me to speak. I showed him the bruise on my wrist, turning my arm so the overhead light caught the darker edges. He studied it quietly, then listened as I explained the missing doses from my organizer and the changes I hadn't authorized. He didn't interrupt, but the lines around his eyes tightened the longer I talked. When he finally turned to his computer, he typed slowly, as if measuring each step. He scrolled through my medication record, frowning at certain entries. One line caught his attention. "These requests didn't come from me," he said, pointing at 2 denied attempts to raise my sedative dosage. The system had rejected them automatically, marking them as inconsistent with my treatment plan. He clicked deeper, following the trail. My name appeared, but not his signature. The dates didn't match any appointments I'd had. The room felt smaller as he kept reading. Then he stopped on a different log entirely. It listed an access attempt made late in the evening from a device the clinic didn't own. He leaned back, uneasy. "Someone tried to get into your file from outside." His tone wasn't dramatic, just firm. That quiet seriousness sent a cold weight through my chest. Someone didn't only want control, they wanted it documented in my chart. A nurse knocked softly before entering to drop off routine forms. She glanced at the bruise, then at the screen, and hesitated. She lowered her voice and said that someone had called earlier in the week, asking whether I would qualify for an assisted living recommendation. She didn't know who it was, just that the question felt unusual for a patient who was walking and thinking clearly. She left the room with a look that said more than her words. When my son picked me up from the clinic later, he handed me a packet of papers the moment I sat down in the car. He called them safety forms, insisting they were meant to protect both of us. The wording was vague, and he pushed them toward me with an urgency that didn't match his smile. I folded them slowly, saying I would read them at home. His jaw tightened before he started the engine. That night I printed every document the clinic had given me, including the logs the doctor allowed me to view. I placed them inside an old folder and slid it into the drawer beneath my winter clothes. My hands shook only once, when I realized someone wasn't waiting for me to decline. Someone was trying to move me there. My son came by that evening carrying a small mug with steam rising off the top. He set it on the table beside me and said it was a night tea, meant to help me sleep better. His tone was too bright, too practiced, as if he had rehearsed the line before walking in. I lifted the cup, noticing a faint bitterness before it even reached my lips. He watched closely as I took the first sip. Within minutes, the room felt slightly tilted, the edges softening like someone had turned down the clarity in my eyes. He didn't seem surprised. I gripped the arm of my chair, trying to steady myself as the dizziness tightened around my temples. My son hovered beside me, telling me to just relax and let the tea do its work. His words were gentle, but his face carried a strange impatience underneath. I excused myself, saying I needed to sit closer to the window for air. He blocked me for a moment, staring, before stepping aside with a stiff nod. My legs felt heavier with each step, and the hallway seemed longer than it had earlier in the day. When he finally stepped out to take a phone call, I used the wall for balance and reached the kitchen sink. The dizziness swayed through my body like a slow wave. A night nurse called shortly after, routine check-in, and I asked her plainly whether the doctor had approved any sleep aids for home use. She paused, then said no order existed for anything of the kind. Her voice sharpened when she asked if I'd taken anything unusual. I told her I'd call back. The silence after I hung up felt colder than the room itself. A crumpled piece of tissue in the trash caught my eye. I pulled it free with shaking fingers. Inside were traces of something white, crushed fine, almost powder. It didn't look like tea leaves. A knot formed heavy in my stomach, and not from the dizziness alone. I wrapped the evidence in a clean towel and slipped it into the drawer beneath the phone charger. Every step back toward the living room felt like stepping toward something I didn't want to acknowledge. When my son returned, I told him I needed to sit down because of the dizziness. His response wasn't concern, it was irritation. He muttered that at this rate I'd need full care soon, the words spoken low and sharp, not meant for comfort. He didn't realize I heard him clearly. The dizziness eased slowly, but the truth settled fast. Whatever he wanted me too weak to resist. I returned to the clinic 2 days later for a scheduled follow-up, moving slower than usual after the dizziness from that night. The waiting area felt too bright, too open, and I kept one hand on the wall as I walked in. A security guard standing near the entrance noticed me and stepped forward with a cautious look. He asked if I could speak with him for a moment, his tone low so others wouldn't overhear. I nodded, already sensing this wasn't routine. He guided me toward a quiet corner by the vending machine. His voice dropped even further as he said he'd been the one watching the monitors during the day I collapsed outside. He described exactly how my son had taken my cane and thrown it aside, and how he'd watched me nearly fall. Hearing someone else repeat the scene made the memory feel sharper. He said he saved the clip in case the clinic needed it, then added that he'd been waiting for a chance to tell me privately. The administrator called me into her office next, her expression serious. She played the footage on a small screen, the parking lot grainy but clear enough to see my son's face and the moment he tossed the cane across the pavement. She paused the frame as I grabbed the railing to keep myself upright. No one spoke for several seconds. She told me they would document what they saw but needed my consent to move forward with the internal report. I said yes. A patient advocate joined us shortly after, carrying a tablet and a stack of printed notes. She explained that there had been several recent attempts to update my medical authority on file. Requests tagged under my son's name, none authorized by me. She circled timestamps showing repeated calls asking about decision-making designation. The pattern made my chest feel tight in a different way than fear. It was something colder, something more final. My doctor came in last, settling into the seat across from me with a level, steady voice. He warned that what he saw matched behaviors he'd reported in past elder coercion cases. Subtle control, attempted alterations, increasing pressure, and now physical intimidation. He said it plainly, this wasn't care, it was control, and it was escalating. They advised restricting my son's access immediately, adding notes to my file to block his involvement. I agreed and signed the forms with a steady hand. As I left, a receptionist mentioned my son had just called asking for a meeting to discuss long-term planning. The stakes rose in a way I could feel deep in my bones. I called my son that morning and told him I was ready to meet with the staff about future care decisions. The words felt heavy in my mouth, but I kept my tone steady. He didn't hide the satisfaction in his voice. He said he'd come right after lunch. When I hung up, a quiet resolve settled in. I had agreed, but on my terms this time. The doctor, advocate, and administrator met with me beforehand in a small conference nook near the ward. They laid out documents, timelines, and still images from the security footage on the table. Each item was placed carefully, as if arranging pieces of a puzzle they had solved before my son even arrived. The administrator suggested we keep the evidence partially covered until the right moment. I nodded, feeling a slow, firm anger replace the fear that had followed me for days. At home the night before, my son's behavior had shifted in a way even he didn't bother to hide. He told me what clothes to wear, choosing a loose shirt and thin jacket without asking if I was warm enough. He hovered around me as I tried to sit, pacing the hallway whenever I took too long to answer a question. His impatience came through sharp and direct. I watched all of it from behind tired eyes, memorizing every detail. A neighbor stopped me outside the house that morning while I waited for the transport van. She glanced around before speaking, as if sharing a secret. She said she overheard my son telling someone, "I won't argue if he can't walk without me." Her voice held a mix of unease and apology. I thanked her, even though my stomach turned at the thought of how he talked when he thought no one was listening. Before leaving the house, I placed printed screenshots from the security footage into a folder, along with the blocked medication requests and notes the advocate prepared. I tucked the folder into the blanket on my lap as they helped me into the wheelchair. Every paper felt like a small shield. My son arrived at the clinic with a swagger that made the receptionist look away. He greeted me loudly, clapping a hand on my shoulder as if we were celebrating something. His eyes darted around, checking who was nearby. The confidence on his face didn't match the tension rising in the room. They wheeled me into a private consultation room, the door closing softly behind us. The air felt thick, charged, waiting. My son sat across from me, tapping the stack of long-term authority papers with the back of his finger. He spoke softly but firmly, telling me we shouldn't drag this out anymore. He pushed the pages closer, acting like this was just another simple form to sign. My hand stayed still on the blanket. I told him I wanted to hear every detail before touching anything. The administrator stepped toward the door and gave a small signal to the security guard waiting outside. The guard entered with a tablet tucked under his arm, nodding once before placing it on the table. My son's eyes flicked toward the screen, then back to me, his posture tightening. The room grew quiet, the kind of silence that feels like it's holding its breath. The administrator tapped the screen, and the footage began. There I was on the recording, moving slowly across the parking lot, leaning on my cane. Then my son appeared beside me, quick and irritated, snatching the cane from my hand. The video showed him tossing it aside as if it meant nothing. His voice played through the speakers, "Walk or fall. Your choice." My stomach tightened as the moment replayed in the cold glow of the tablet. My son's shoulders stiffened. He opened his mouth, claiming he'd been under a lot of stress lately, saying it was a bad moment taken out of context. His voice shook in a way I hadn't heard before. The doctor folded his arms, the advocate leaned forward slightly, and the administrator didn't interrupt. They let the weight of the footage settle on the room. The advocate then slid a folder across the table, opening it to show system logs of attempted medication changes and unauthorized file access. She read each timestamp clearly, naming the phone number used to make the calls. My son tried to interrupt, insisting he'd only been trying to help manage things. His explanation sounded thin even to him. The evidence lay open between us like an undeniable truth. When the advocate mentioned the altered pill schedule and the missing doses, his face changed, something tightening at the edges. He exhaled and muttered, he needed to be dependent first. The words came out raw, unguarded, before he realized what he had admitted. The doctor sat back in his chair, eyes fixed on him with calm disbelief. My breath caught in my chest. No one spoke for several seconds. The room felt heavy, the kind of heavy that settles after something irreversible has been said. The administrator began documenting statements while the guard remained near the door. My son looked down at his hands, and for the first time, he had nothing left to say. The advocate finished gathering the statements and stepped out of the room with the administrator. A few minutes later she returned, holding a set of forms that needed my signature to proceed with formal reports. Her tone was steady and calm as she explained each one: elder abuse, medical manipulation attempts, and unauthorized access to protected records. I signed with a firm hand. The weight of what my son had done settled over me like a cold shadow. By evening, the hospital security office had issued an official restriction. My son was banned from accessing my information, entering the ward, or speaking to any staff on my behalf. The administrator added protective alerts to my chart, highlighted in bright red, visible to every nurse and doctor assigned to me. For the first time in weeks, I felt a thin layer of safety forming around me. It wasn't comfort, but it was structure, something solid enough to lean on. Word reached my extended family faster than I expected. A cousin called, saying she couldn't believe I'd accused my own son. Another relative texted a short message defending him, claiming he was under pressure and meant well. But most stayed silent. Their silence stung as much as their disbelief. People choose sides quietly, sometimes by doing nothing. I felt that truth settle deep inside me. Later that night, as I sat in the quiet of my hospital room, the emotional weight hit harder than any physical pain. I had raised that boy. I had trusted him with the parts of life that felt too heavy after my wife died. To see his intentions laid bare, calculating, careless with my safety, felt like something inside me had cracked. I didn't cry. The hurt sat heavier than tears would allow. The doctor came in for a final check and spoke gently, reminding me that this was now a documented case and that protective steps were already in place. He encouraged me to secure my home once I was discharged. I nodded, already forming a plan in my mind. Locks would be changed. Medication would be stored in a controlled cabinet. Caregiver visits would be confirmed directly with the agency, never through family. Every decision would pass through my own hands. When the lights dimmed for the night, I lay awake, looking at the faint glow of the monitors. I understood now that closeness and safety were not the same thing. Distance, painful as it was, would keep me alive. I accepted it quietly, without bitterness. Just a tired clarity that had taken too long to surface. The first morning back home felt strange. The house was quiet, familiar, but different now that stronger locks were installed and the security company had updated the system. I walked through each room slowly, checking cabinets, drawers, and the medication box the clinic had secured for me. Everything was in its place, untouched. That small certainty gave me a steadiness I hadn't felt in weeks. I moved carefully with my new cane, keeping it close. I understood now how something simple, something meant to help, could become a point of danger if placed in the wrong hands. The clinic had arranged for a caregiver to check on me twice a week, someone I could call directly without going through anyone else. It wasn't about losing independence. It was about choosing who had access to it. That distinction mattered more to me now than it ever had. Each day, I followed the routines the doctor suggested: medication logs, scheduled walks, slow stretching that kept my legs steady. I kept all my documents in a locked drawer, and only I held the key. Authority forms were sealed, reviewed by my attorney, and protected with alerts that prevented any changes without my presence. These were small steps, but they gave me something I had almost forgotten: control over my own life. Sometimes in the evening, I found myself thinking about the nurse who whispered that first warning. Her eyes had carried something I didn't understand then, but I understood now: experience. She had seen this type of pattern before. If she hadn't spoken up, if the staff hadn't looked deeper, I might not be standing in my own kitchen tonight. Gratitude settled into me like a quiet truth, steady and grounding. I also understood something heavier. Love, even from your own blood, does not guarantee safety. Age exposes the cracks in people: the impatience, the ambition, the hunger for control. When your body slows down, some people see an opening instead of a responsibility. I had never wanted to believe that about my own son, but denial almost cost me more than pride. It nearly cost me my freedom. Still, I didn't shut the world out. I learned to balance independence with vetted support. I allowed help where it was safe, and I refused it where it wasn't. And in that balance, I found a strength I thought old age had taken from me. As I locked the front door that night, I understood the lesson fully. Protect your health and your autonomy, because once someone else takes charge of them, your life stops belonging to you. And a man shouldn't have to learn that lesson as late as I did.